Section 21 of the Letters of Jane Austen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Letter 48. Godmersham Park, Monday, October 11th. My dearest Aunt Cass, I have just asked Aunt Jane to let me write a little in her letter, but she does not like it, so I won't. Good-bye. You will have Edward's letter to-morrow. He tells me that he did not send you any news to interfere with mine, but I do not think there is much for anybody to send at present. We had our dinner party on Wednesday, with the addition of Mrs. and Miss Milles, who were under a promise of dining here in their return from Eastwell, whenever they paid their visit of duty there, and it happened to be paid on that day. Both mother and daughter are much as I have always found them. I like the mother, first because she reminds me of Mrs. Birch, and secondly because she is cheerful and grateful for what she is at the age of 90 and upwards. The day was pleasant enough. I sat by Mr. Chisholm, and we talked away at a great rate about nothing worth hearing. It was a mistake as to the day of the Sherers' going being fixed. They are ready, but are waiting for Mr. Paget's answer. I inquired of Mrs. Milles after Jemima Bridges, and was quite grieved to hear that she was obliged to leave Canterbury some months ago on account of her debts, and is nobody knows where. What an unprosperous family! On Saturday, soon after breakfast, Mr. J. P. left us for Norton Court. I like him very much. He gives me the idea of a very amiable young man, only too diffident to be so agreeable as he might be. He was out the chief of each morning with the other two, shooting and getting wet through. To-morrow we are to know whether he and 100 young ladies will come here for the ball. I do not much expect any. The Deeds cannot meet us. They have engagements at home. I will finish the Deeds by saying that they are not likely to come here till quite late in my stay, the very last week perhaps, and I do not expect to see the Moores at all. They are not solicited till after Edward's return from Hampshire. Monday, November 15th, is the day now fixed for our setting out. Poor Basingstoke races! There seem to have been 2 particularly wretched days on purpose for them, and Weyhill week does not begin much happier. We were quite surprised by a letter from Anna at Tollard Royal last Saturday, but perfectly approve her going, and only regret they should all go so far to stay so few days. We had thunder and lightning here on Thursday morning, between 5 and 7. No very bad thunder, but a great deal of lightning. It has given the commencement of a season of wind and rain, and perhaps for the next 6 weeks we shall not have 2 dry days together. Lizzie is very much obliged to you for your letter, and will answer it soon, but has so many things to do that it may be 4 or 5 days before she can. This is quite her own message, spoken in rather a desponding tone. Your letter gave pleasure to all of us. We had all the reading of it, of course. I 3 times, as I undertook, to the great relief of Lizzie, to read it to Sackree, and afterwards to Louisa. Sackree does not at all approve of Mary Doe and her nuts, on the score of propriety rather than health. She saw some signs of going after her in George and Henry, and thinks if you could give the girl a check, by rather reproving her for taking anything seriously about nuts which they said to her, it might be of use. This, of course, is between our 3 discreet selves, a scene of triennial bliss. Mrs. Breton called here on Saturday. I never saw her before. She is a large, ungenteel woman, with self-satisfied and would-be elegant manners. We are certain of some visitors to-morrow. Edward Bridges comes for 2 nights in his way from Lenham to Ramsgate, and brings a friend, name unknown, but supposed to be a Mr. Harper, a neighboring clergyman, and Mr. R. Maskell is to shoot with the young men, which it is to be supposed will end in his staying dinner. On Thursday, Mr. Lushington, M.P. for Canterbury, and manager of the Lodge Hounds, dines here and stays the night. He is chiefly young Edward's acquaintance. If I can, I will get a frank from him, and write to you all the sooner. I suppose the Ashford ball will furnish something. As I wrote of my nephews with a little bitterness in my last, I think it particularly incumbent on me to do them justice now, and I have great pleasure in saying they were both at the sacrament yesterday. After having much praised or much blamed anybody, one is generally sensible of something just the reverse soon afterwards. Now these two boys, who are out with the foxhounds, will come home and disgust me again by some habit of luxury or some proof of sporting mania, unless I keep it off by this prediction. They amuse themselves very comfortably in the evening by netting. They are each about a rabbit net, and sit as deedily to it side by side as any two Uncle Franks could do. I am looking over self-control again, and my opinion is confirmed of its being an excellently meant, elegantly written work, without anything of nature or probability in it. I declare I do not know whether Laura's passage down the American river is not the most natural, possible, every-day thing she ever does. Tuesday. Dear me, what is to become of me? Such a long letter! 42 lines in the second page. Like Harriet Byron, I ask, what am I to do with my gratitude? I can do nothing but thank you and go on. A few of your inquiries, I think, are replied to en avance. The name of F. Cage's drawing-master is O'Neill. We are exceedingly amused with your Sheldon news, and your self-reproach on the subject of Mrs. Stockwell made me laugh heartily. I rather wondered that Johncock, the only person in the room, could help laughing too. I had not heard before of her having the measles. Mrs. H. and Althea's staying till Friday was quite new to me. A good plan, however. I could not have settled it better myself, and am glad they found so much in the house to approve, and I hope they will ask Martha to visit them. I admire the sagacity and taste of Charlotte Williams. Those large dark eyes always judge well. I will compliment her by naming a heroine after her. Edward has had all the particulars of the building, etc., read to him twice over, and seems very well satisfied. A narrow door to the pantry is the only subject of solicitude. It is certainly just the door which should not be narrow, on account of the trays; but if a case of necessity, it must be borne. I knew there was sugar in the tin, but had no idea of there being enough to last through your company. All the better. You ought not to think this new loaf better than the other, because that was the first of 5 which all came together. Something of fancy, perhaps, and something of imagination. Dear Mrs. Digweed, I cannot bear that she should not be foolishly happy after a ball. I hope Miss Yates and her companions were all well the day after their arrival. I am thoroughly rejoiced that Miss Benn has placed herself in lodgings, though I hope they may not be long necessary. No letter from Charles yet. Southey's Life of Nelson. I am tired of Lives of Nelson, being that I never read any. I will read this, however, if Frank is mentioned in it. Here am I in Kent, with one brother in the same county and another brother's wife, and see nothing of them, which seems unnatural. It will not last so forever, I trust. I should like to have Mrs. F. A. and her children here for a week, but not a syllable of that nature is ever breathed. I wish her last visit had not been so long a one. I wonder whether Mrs. Tilson has ever lain in. Mention it if it ever comes to your knowledge, and we shall hear of it by the same post from Henry. Mr. Rob Maskell breakfasted here. He eats a great deal of butter. I dined upon goose yesterday, which I hope will secure a good sale of my second edition. Have you any tomatoes? Fanny and I regale on them every day. Disastrous letters from the Plumptrees and Oxendons. Refusals everywhere. A blank partout. And it is not quite certain whether we go or not. Something may depend upon the disposition of Uncle Edward when he comes, and upon what we hear at Chilham Castle this morning, for we are going to pay visits. We are going to each house at Chilham and Mystole. I shall like seeing the Faggs. I shall like it all, except that we are to set out so early that I have not time to write as I wish. Edward Bridges' friend is a Mr. Hawker, I find, not Harper. I would not have you sleep in such an error for the world. My brother desires his best love and thanks for all your information. He hopes the roots of the old beech have been dug away enough to allow a proper covering of mould and turf. He is sorry for the necessity of building the new coin, but hopes they will contrive that the doorway should be of the usual width, if it must be contracted on one side, by widening it on the other. The appearance need not signify, and he desires me to say that your being at Chawton when he is will be quite necessary. You cannot think it more indispensable than he does. He is very much obliged to you for your attention to everything. Have you any idea of returning with him to Henrietta Street and finishing your visit then? Tell me your sweet little innocent ideas. Everything of love and kindness, proper and improper, must now suffice. Yours very affectionately, J. Austen. Letter 49. Godmersham Park, Thursday, October 14th. My dearest Cassandra, now I will prepare for Mr. Lushington, and as it will be wisest also to prepare for his not coming or my not getting a frank, I shall write very close from the first, and even leave room for the seal in the proper place. When I have followed up my last with this, I shall feel somewhat less unworthy of you than the state of our correspondence now requires. I left off in a great hurry to prepare for our morning visits. Of course was ready a great deal the first, and need not have hurried so much. Fanny wore her new gown and cap. I was surprised to find my stole so pretty. The ladies were at home. I was in luck, and saw Lady Fagg and all her 5 daughters, with an old Mrs. Hamilton from Canterbury, and Mrs. and Miss Chapman from Margate into the bargain. I never saw so plain a family. 5 sisters so very plain. They are as plain as the Foresters, or the Franfredops, or the Seagraves, or the Rivers, excluding Sophie. Miss Sally Fagg has a pretty figure, and that comprises all the good looks of the family. It was stupidish. Fanny did her part very well, but there was a lack of talk altogether, and the 3 friends in the house only sat by and looked at us. However, Miss Chapman's name is Laura, and she had a double flounce to her gown. You really must get some flounces. Are not some of your large stock of white morning gowns just in a happy state for a flounce? Too short? Nobody at home at either house in Chilham. Edward Bridges and his friend did not forget to arrive. The friend is a Mr. Wigram, one of the 23 children of a rich great mercantile, Sir Robert Wigram, an old acquaintance of the Footes, but very recently known to Edward B. The history of his coming here is that, intending to go from Ramsgate to Brighton, Edward B. persuaded him to take Lenham on his way, which gave him the convenience of Mr. W.'s gig, and the comfort of not being alone there; but, probably thinking a few days of Godmersham would be the cheapest and pleasantest way of entertaining his friend and himself, offered a visit here, and here they stay till to-morrow. Mr. W. is about 5 or 26, not ill-looking, and not agreeable. He is certainly no addition. A sort of cool, gentlemanlike manner, but very silent. They say his name is Henry, a proof how unequally the gifts of fortune are bestowed. I have seen many a John and Thomas much more agreeable. We have got rid of Mr. R. Maskell, however. I did not like him either. He talks too much, and is conceited, besides having a vulgarly shaped mouth. He slept here on Tuesday, so that yesterday Fanny and I sat down to breakfast with 6 gentlemen to admire us. We did not go to the ball. It was left to her to decide, and at last she determined against it. She knew that it would be a sacrifice on the part of her father and brothers if they went, and I hope it will prove that she has not sacrificed much. It is not likely that there should have been anybody there whom she would care for. I was very glad to be spared the trouble of dressing and going, and being weary before it was half over, so my gown and my cap are still unworn. It will appear at last, perhaps, that I might have done without either. I produced my brown bombazine yesterday, and it was very much admired indeed, and I like it better than ever. You have given many particulars of the state of Chawton House, but still we want more. Edward wants to be expressly told that all the round tower, etc., is entirely down, and the door from the best room stopped up. He does not know enough of the appearance of things in that quarter. He heard from Bath yesterday. Lady B. continues very well, and Dr. Parry's opinion is that while the water agrees with her, she ought to remain there, which throws their coming away at a greater uncertainty than we had supposed. It will end, perhaps, in a fit of the gout, which may prevent her coming away. Louisa thinks her mother's being so well may be quite as much owing to her being out of doors as to the water. Lady B. is going to try the hot pump, the cross bath being about to be painted. Louisa is particularly well herself, and thinks the water has been of use to her. She mentioned our inquiries, etc., to Mr. and Mrs. Alex. Evelyn, and had their best compliments and thanks to give in return. Dr. Parry does not expect Mr. E. to last much longer. Only think of Mrs. Holder's being dead! Poor woman! She has done the only thing in the world she could possibly do to make one cease to abuse her. Now, if you please, Hooper must have it in his power to do more by his uncle. Lucky for the little girl! An Anne Elkins can hardly be so unfit for the care of a child as a Mrs. Holder. A letter from Wrotham yesterday offering an early visit here, and Mr. and Mrs. Moore and one child are to come on Monday for 10 days. I hope Charles and Fanny may not fix the same time, but if they come at all in October they must. What is the use of hoping? The 2 parties of children is the chief evil. To be sure, here we are. The very thing has happened, or rather worse, a letter from Charles this very morning, which gives us reason to suppose they may come here to day. It depends upon the weather, and the weather is now very fine. No difficulties are made, however, and indeed there will be no want of room. But I wish there were no Wigrams and Lushingtons in the way to fill up the table and make us such a motley set. I cannot spare Mr. Lushington either, because of his frank, but Mr. Wigram does no good to anybody. I cannot imagine how a man can have the impudence to come to a family party for 3 days where he is quite a stranger, unless he knows himself to be agreeable on undoubted authority. He and Edward B. are going to ride to Eastwell, and as the boys are hunting, and my brother is gone to Canterbury, Fanny and I have a quiet morning before us. Edward has driven off poor Mrs. Salkeld. It was thought a good opportunity of doing something towards clearing the house. By her own desire, Mrs. Fanny is to be put in the room next the nursery, her baby in a little bed beside her, and as Cassy is to have the closet within, and Betsy Williams's little hole, they will all be very snug together. I shall be most happy to see dear Charles, and he'll be as happy as he can with a cross child, or some such care, pressing on him at the time. I should be very happy in the idea of seeing little Cassy again too, did not I fear she would disappoint me by some immediate disagreeableness. The comfort of the billiard table here is very great. It draws all the gentlemen to it whenever they are within, especially after dinner, so that my brother, Fanny, and I have the library to ourselves and delightful quiet. There is no truth in the report of G. Hatton being to marry Miss Wemmons. He desires it may be contradicted. Have you done anything about our present Miss Benn? I suppose she must have a bed at my mother's whenever she dines there. How will they manage as to inviting her when you are gone? And if they invite, how will they continue to entertain her? Let me know as many of your parting arrangements as you can, as to wine, etc. I wonder whether the ink bottle has been filled. Does butcher's meat keep up with the same price, and is not bread lower than 2s. 6d? Mary's blue gown! My mother must be in agonies. I have a great mind to have my blue gown dyed some time or other. I proposed it once to you, and you made some objection, I forget what. It is the fashion of flounces that gives it particular expediency. Mrs. and Miss Wildman have just been here. Miss is very plain. I wish Lady B. may be returned before we leave Godmersham, that Fanny may spend the time of her father's absence at Goodnestone, which is what she would prefer. Friday. They came last night at about 7. We had given them up, but I still expected them to come. Dessert was nearly over, a better time for arriving than an hour and a half earlier. They were late because they did not set out earlier, and did not allow time enough. Charles did not aim at more than reaching Sittingbourne by 3, which could not have brought them here by dinner time. They had a very rough passage. He would not have ventured if he had known how bad it would be. However, here they are, safe and well, just like their own nice selves, Fanny looking as neat and white this morning as possible, and dear Charles all affectionate, placid, quiet, cheerful good humour. They are both looking very well, but poor little Cassy is grown extremely thin, and looks poorly. I hope a week's country air and exercise may do her good. I am sorry to say it can be but a week. The baby does not appear so large in proportion as she was, nor quite so pretty, but I have seen very little of her. Cassy was too tired and bewildered just at first to seem to know anybody. We met them in the hall, the women and girl part of us, but before we reached the library she kissed me very affectionately, and has since seemed to recollect me in the same way. It was quite an evening of confusion, as you may suppose. At first we were all walking about from one part of the house to the other. Then came a fresh dinner in the breakfast-room for Charles and his wife, which Fanny and I attended. Then we moved into the library, were joined by the dining-room people, were introduced, and so forth. And then we had tea and coffee, which was not over till past 10. Billiards again drew all the odd ones away, and Edward, Charles, the two Fannys, and I sat snugly talking. I shall be glad to have our numbers a little reduced, and by the time you receive this we shall be only a family, though a large family, party. Mr. Lushington goes to-morrow. Now I must speak of him, and I like him very much. I am sure he is clever, and a man of taste. He got a volume of Milton last night, and spoke of it with warmth. He is quite an M.P., very smiling, with an exceeding good address and readiness of language. I am rather in love with him. I dare say he is ambitious and insincere. He puts me in mind of Mr. Dundas. He has a wide smiling mouth and very good teeth, and something the same complexion and nose. He is a much shorter man, with Martha's leave. Does Martha never hear from Mrs. Craven? Is Mrs. Craven never at home? We breakfasted in the dining-room to-day, and are now all pretty well dispersed and quiet. Charles and George are gone out shooting together, to Winnigates and Seaton Wood. I asked on purpose to tell Henry. Mr. Lushington and Edward are gone some other way. I wish Charles may kill something, but this high wind is against their sport. Lady Williams is living at the Rose in Sittingbourne. They called upon her yesterday. She cannot live at Sheerness, and as soon as she gets to Sittingbourne is quite well. In return for all your matches, I announce that her brother William is going to marry a Miss Austen of a Wiltshire family, who say they are related to us. I talked to Cassy about Chawton. She remembers much, but does not volunteer on the subject. Poor little love! I wish she were not so very Palmery, but it seems stronger than ever. I never knew a wife's family features have such undue influence. Papa and mamma have not made up their mind as to parting with her or not. The chief, indeed the only difficulty with mamma is a very reasonable one, the child's being very unwilling to leave them. When it was mentioned to her she did not like the idea of it at all. At the same time she has been suffering so much lately from sea-sickness that her mamma cannot bear to have her much on board this winter. Charles is less inclined to part with her. I do not know how it will end, or what is to determine it. He desires his best love to you, and has not written because he has not been able to decide. They are both very sensible of your kindness on the occasion. I have made Charles furnish me with something to say about young Kendall. He is going on very well. When he first joined the Namur, my brother did not find him forward enough to be what they call put in the office, and therefore placed him under the schoolmaster; but he is very much improved, and goes into the office now every afternoon, still attending school in the morning. This cold weather comes very fortunately for Edward's nerves, with such a house full. It suits him exactly. He is all alive and cheerful. Poor James, on the contrary, must be running his toes into the fire. I find that Mary Jane Fowle was very near returning with her brother and paying them a visit on board. I forget exactly what hindered her. I believe the Cheltenham scheme. I am glad something did. They are to go to Cheltenham on Monday se'nnight. I don't vouch for their going, you know. It only comes from one of the family. Now I think I have written you a good-sized letter, and may deserve whatever I can get in reply. Infinities of love. I must distinguish that of Fanny senior, who particularly desires to be remembered to you all. Yours very affectionately, J. Austen. End of Section 21.